Well, hello. Thank you for joining us today. Nicholas here too, right?
Yeah.
Appreciate your time. And it's a bit late on a Friday, and we realize that a lot of people have gone, but we're really glad to have a chance to talk to you today. My name is James Paxton. I'm from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And I'm sure each of us will go through and introduce the rest of the group here. So I'll let Josh introduce himself. He's got a microphone.
So my name is Josh Davis. I'm an ER physician in Wichita, Kansas. I practice at a community site. I'm the assistant medical director for research quality and ultrasound at our site. And then Nick Harrison is supposedly going to be with us. We're going to give him some grace with the fire alarm. He's the one at the tail end. And if not, I can pick it up from there too.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah. It's a pretty rough situation today. But we don't have, in fact, he's the only guy that put some disclosures down, so we're free to go, I think.
Maybe I need some advice from him, so I can get a list like that.
He's got a lot there. So today our objectives for this session, we're going to really kind of talk about what is a systematic review. Speak of the guy there. We just shared your disclosures. I hope you don't mind us disclosing that. So we also hope to kind of explain the difference between a systematic review, scoping review, narrative review, meta-analysis. These are terms that you hear a lot. Not everybody really knows the difference between some of these things. Talk about some best practices when you're conducting a systematic review, and then some tips for writing and publishing a review. So I think this is probably one way to view this whole process. You get what you put in, and so when you read a lot of the reviews that are out there, you can tell how much work they put in and how systematic they were. I've been affiliated with all kinds of different reviews, so I fully appreciate the value of a narrative review. This is an expert in the field who's talking about a subject that they know and love. But I think the amount of work you put in is definitely ends up being worth it, because people who know the literature and understand the process, when they see a well-written, well-crafted review, they appreciate that. So I think that's the encouragement I give to junior investigators, especially when they haven't done it before and they start getting their feet wet and realize how hard this can be, that the other people will appreciate the work you're putting in. So we'll talk a little bit about definitions here. So a review, in kind of a general term, would use explicit systematic methods to collate and synthesize findings of studies that address a clearly formulated question. This is a systematic review definition. So the name's in the definition, right? It makes sense. Systematic, meaning it's well structured and there's a system to it. It's reproducible. And it's really a lot of work. There's a lot to do, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the reasons why people do systematic review. A systematic review, by definition being systematic, distinguishes it from a narrative review. Some people call those invited reviews, right? Maybe you've seen them, read them, maybe you've written them. And they're just reviews where you identify an author, or the author identifies himself, selects the topic, and then just culls whatever data, whatever manuscripts they think are relevant to the topic, puts it into a concise format that's hopefully well written, and then they publish that, right? But it's not rigorous. It doesn't, it's certainly not reproducible, I would argue. In fact, I think if you went to the same author 10 years later and said, write that paper again, they would write a whole different paper, right? So that's one of the disadvantages of those kind of reviews, is it's really dependent on who's writing it and when they're writing it, versus something like a systematic review where it's research-based, systematic, reproducible. That's key. That's key. So the idea being that you should, if you had 10 people doing a systematic review, and they use the same methods, the same a priori methods, they should probably get the exact same result. Now, maybe how they write that up would differ, right? But you'd hope that they'd have the exact same manuscripts included. It should be rigorous. I think we've kind of beaten that horse. And it's going to reduce the bias. That's the idea. So that's why we favor systematic reviews, why we value them highly, because they are less risk of bias than an invited review. And pretty well respected, I would say, as well. So, and then there's a lot of confusion sometimes, especially in junior learners, about, well, what's a meta-analysis? If that's a systematic review, what's a meta-analysis? And I kind of tell them it's a little bit like peanut butter and jelly. You know, a lot of times they go together, but you can still eat peanut butter without the jelly. So you can still have a systematic review and not do the meta-analysis. But the idea being that you're taking the data from the manuscripts, from the original data sources, and you're putting them in, mixing the pot, and coming out with some calculations that support where we're at in the literature and so forth. And so a meta-analysis is kind of the data side of a systematic review in many ways. And you can't always use all of the manuscripts that you would include in a systematic review by your search criteria. Not all of them are going to be conducive to the meta-analysis. So you're going to want to define sometimes those terms separately, what you're going to use as conclusion for the meta-analysis, the data part of it, and what you're going to use for the systematic review. A scoping review is really intended to kind of just see what do we know? Where are the boundaries, the frontiers in the field that I'm interested in talking about? And of course, a narrative review I mentioned before is kind of like a person's opinion, really, but supported by evidence, supported by manuscripts and data. So how does this work? How do you get started? I mean, I think this, for those of us who've done reviews before, this is probably intuitive, but I think at the same time, those who haven't, it can be kind of daunting. Like, where do you get started with this? And like everything important in research, you've got to start with a good question, right? And so it's not necessarily a question that you think is good, because you might have a really clear idea what you think is good, but it's probably got to be a question that's not already answered, that the information's actually out there somewhere, and that other people are going to be interested in, right? Once you figure out what your question is going to be, then you got to get help. Even a review is hard to do on your own. And there's a lot of great software out there, ways to help people work together. If you haven't used Covidence before, or Covidence, I don't know how you guys like to pronounce it, but it's a really great application that you can use to collaborate together on systematic reviews, for example. It helps you screen articles, and your librarian can even dump the PDFs into the Covidence software so that they can be working behind the scenes to support you in your effort to go through the articles. You've got a research protocol, so you're going to have some pretty clearly defined inclusion, exclusion criteria. It doesn't feel like a real, like those of us who do research call it a pro-research protocol. It sounds kind of weird, like when there's no patients here, there's no medical charts, but at the same time, you have to have kind of a system of how you're doing it. Again, getting back to the systematic idea here. The search strategy is super important when you're doing a systematic review, because not only do you have to explain yourself when you write that up, when you go to publish that manuscript, that review, but you also, again, want it to be reproducible. So you don't just specify the terms, but you also talk about which databases that you looked at, right? And you have to be very explicit about that. Sometimes when you read these reviews and you look at the search terms, there can be quite a few of them in there, right? It can be like half a page sometimes of different search terms that were used. And then you have to go through, once you've got your search strategy sorted, you've figured out which articles exist in the literature that fit your search criteria. The next step is to go through and really pick out the studies that fit, right? And there can be lots of reasons why a study will fall out. Sometimes it's not written in English, right? Because depending on the database you use, they might pull a lot of Russian and Dutch things. And if you've decided to only include English articles, you've got to take those out. Sometimes there's just almost like advertisements or other things that pop up that you're just like, I don't even know how this ended up on the list, but there it is. So what you find is that you get maybe thousands and thousands of articles fed into the Covidence or dug up by the librarian, and then it turns out that maybe only 100 of them are actually like fitting into your criteria. So that part of it can be a little bit frustrating, going through a lot of different articles. But at the end of the day, that's where a lot of the hard work lives, is getting the screening process done and doing it well. So if you have more than one person working on that screening process, you want to make sure that everybody's fully on the same page with regard to the inclusions and exclusions. You agree on them. And sometimes as you go through the process, you'll realize that there were inclusions or exclusions that you forgot to think of, right? And it's perfectly okay, in my mind at least, to define those as you go and to change and modify those as long as you're consistent throughout the whole process. So that may require, if you do add a category of exclusions, you may have to go back and look at the ones you've already screened to see if any of them might now fall out based on your new exclusion. So it's important to think about that. But once you have your studies selected, then you're going to extract your data. And there are a lot of techniques to be used with that. We'll talk about some things relating to data as we go forward. You're going to obviously analyze your data if you're going to do meta-analysis or even just doing a systematic review. You've got names and papers and things of that nature. Then you got to write and publish. Of course, add it to your CV, right? You got to get credit for your work. So there's a lot of different steps involved here. But the fact that we have defined names for these steps, and it's pretty systematic, will help you to identify kind of what the next step is going to be as you go forward. So how would you formulate a research question? Well, I mentioned before, it's really got to be something that you're interested in and something that people will think people are interested in, but also it has to be well written, right? So a lot of us are familiar with this PICO model, and what that means is the P is the population that you're interested in studying, and that can be defined broadly or very narrowly. So I could say diabetic 40-year-old males at Detroit Receiving Hospital who present with leg pain. That could be my population, and I might not have a lot of patients in that population, right? Versus something more general. So the population in this case would be what type of articles do you want to include? What's your question? And then how are you going to explain that to someone else in terms of which manuscripts you're looking for? How would you write that down? What is the intervention? A main intervention or exposure in this setting is a little bit harder to define sometimes. I think if you're doing a systematic review that involves an intervention of some sort, that would be relevant here, okay? The alternatives, what's the comparator, and then the outcome, or what improvement or measurement would you expect. So the research question for a systematic review is defined just like it is for a prospective research study, retrospective research study, the same idea. The difference is you're not collecting the data, you're actually finding other people who've collected the data, right? So it's not that different than developing your own research study, it's just that you're not going to do the data collection on the subjects, you're going to use secondary data that's original to somebody else's research. So I think the team is an important part of this, and a lot of people, especially really junior researchers, will think that they can do this all themselves, and most of the time they find out pretty quickly that they can't. And I really encourage anyone in the audience out there who's looking at doing a systematic review to start by counting your fingers and counting your friends, right? And so who do you have that you can pull into this project that's available? And ask someone who's done one before to find out who you're going to need. We're talking about some of the resources now, but I think a librarian, for me, is essential to have somebody who can help me pull these articles, help me define my search terms, help me figure out which databases to search for my data. And I know these guys have opinions on that too. So the research protocol that you're going to write, and again, it's not that different than an original research protocol, has a lot of the same components. You're going to have an objective. What am I trying to find? What am I looking for? What type of articles do I want? And then the search strategy, as I mentioned. You have search terms, search databases. Which databases am I going to use? Inclusions and exclusions. And I think, as I said before, you're probably going to forget to put stuff down, some of them that you're going to want to use. So oftentimes you'll learn as you go forward. This manuscript is not the kind of thing I wanted to include. Like, for example, a common one is case reports. So a lot of people will forget to include that as an exclusion. And if you're not clear on that between the different people screening the manuscripts, then you get into you're on the 527th one, and suddenly it's a case report, and you're like, well, what do I do with this? It's original data, but it's a case report, one patient. If you didn't already define that, now you're going to have to make a decision. So you have to really kind of communicate back and forth between the people that are screening the articles to make sure that you're all using the exact same criteria. And analysis methods, we have more to come on that. Protocol registration, I think there are different ways, different registration formats, different ways to register your protocol, and we'll probably talk about that as well. Search strategy, I'm going to, I think, hand it over to Josh here. He'll give us some good insight into that.
Yeah, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a more detailed example of an article that I wrote using and some of the hiccups that we kind of had along the way. I think we've all done this enough to learn that there are plenty of times, and you're not going to hit it out of the park on your first one. We've all had hiccups. I think some of them being, like you said, not planning in advance, not changing when you know you need to change. It's frustrating to have to go back, but it's better to do it sooner than to wait until the end of the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a search strategy. So this is an example of some of the databases that you can use and some of the search terms. This is why a librarian is I don't want to say an essential part of the team, team, but a very valued team member is to have someone who's a librarian who knows how to use these what we call kind of Boolean terms and these other asterisks, ands, ors to put basically your search strategy into like a math equation. And then these are the different databases, and some of them, there are lots of other ones as well. And depending on what topic you're looking to study, you should, best practice is to use at least 2 databases, because you don't want to just look in one database, even though we all think that PubMed is the only database that exists and the only one we ever have to look in. That's not necessarily true. There's lots of data, for example, educational data that would be in like the ERIC database, or there's a lot of nursing things necessarily in other databases. So you want to make sure that you look at other databases. And in addition to like case reports, for example, you also have to decide, are you going to search for gray literature? And gray literature is things that are like abstracts and white papers, and preprints now are a big thing that's coming out as well. And there are all separate databases. I think some of you have read some of the COVID literature, may have been exposed to like medRxiv and like some of the other preprint databases as well. And you just have to decide up front if you're going to do that. Or for example, if you're doing an observational and you decide you're not doing case reports, what about a case series? What if it has 3 patients in it? Is that an observational study? What about 10 patients? Like you kind of have to think about these things up front, and then sometimes trial by fire and realize it kind of afterwards. This is an example of some of the search strategy that I wanted to highlight. So you need to decide some of the limits that you're going to do. So this is what we did in our different databases and what years we searched them from, what other limits we put on it. So for example, English, you could use the filters in the databases. Like for example, PubMed, if you want to look for randomized trials, you can limit it by that, but you have to acknowledge that those filters aren't perfect, and you can sometimes miss things by the more exclusionary that you get. And this is just one example of these Ovid Medline. There's a handful of different kind of versions of Ovid Medline kind of database that you can look in. And then we also had to do this for Cinol and Scopus. And so this particular paper that we did was on feedback and assessment tools for handoffs. And one of the things when you're doing your search strategies is you have to recognize that there's lots of different terms that are used. And so you're going to have to pull some literature ahead of time to identify these terms. So, this one is handoff, handover, sign out, transfer of care, shift to shift. All of those things are different terms in the literature. You have to acknowledge, internationally, for example, like we call it an emergency department. Some people call it like an accident, so you might have to use that term. Or if you want to look up, hospice studies, you probably also want to use the term palliative, and there's other things that you want to kind of put in there. And then in addition to using the keywords, you also up here, you'll see the controlled vocabulary. So in this database, they're called MESH terms or medical subject headings. And so those are the ones that have the pre-filters that are done by the database as well. And again, best practice is to use both of them, use the keywords and whatever the controlled vocabulary is. In Ovid, it's medical subject headings. I'll show you an example here. In Cinol, it's medical headings. You can see at the end of this. And what you have to do actually is to put together basically a math equation of all of your, and you'll notice all these different parentheses here. So you take all of your handover, words, and that's your one. You link them all together, and then you put them together plus and with all of your kind of shift. Your feedback or education or whatever kind of other topic you want to put together, and then you can put your limitations on it as well. And then your study selection is once you put those into your databases, you're going to get a spit out of hundreds of pages of thousands of articles if you've kind of done this and had a good enough process. And the goal is to be more open at the beginning and then narrow as you get down. So you don't want to miss any articles just because your search strategy wasn't good. You really want to make an active effort to identify all the studies in your search strategy, and then you can weed them out by kind of reading the titles and doing so, acknowledging that after a certain number, it's too big for anyone to handle. I typically use the number around like 10,000 is probably too much for a single kind of systematic review, and that's probably even on the upper end. It will take months to kind of go through that. But you want to have a multi-step process with independent reviewers, so you want to have 2 different people so that I think Dr. Paxton and I were talking like if I blink at the one time because I'm falling asleep reading the 437th page of reference number 8,333, if I blink at that time and don't don't catch that one, you want someone else to also have seen that so that they have the opportunity to do so. And then you have these pre-specified inclusion and exclusion criteria that we've already talked about, but you want to make sure it's okay to have an iterative process here. You just have to be willing to go back, and it's better to do that sooner. So everybody does 100 and reads through the first 100 titles, and then you realize how you want to change it, instead of everybody doing all 10,000 and then being like, oops, we forgot this, now you have to go back and do it all over again. And then my one key tip here is to record your reasons for exclusion from the beginning. Again, having had to go back and do it all over again, not a fun process to have to go back and redo that when you could have just done it initially. And then as far as data extraction, I want to talk about, it needs to be systematic as well. Again, under the umbrella of systematic review. You want to do the same thing with your record selection that you want to do with your data extraction, which is to pilot test your form of what data you're going to abstract, and have independent trained reviewers, again, a dual kind of blinded process, so that you make sure that, again, as you're reading through these full page articles, that in line 37 of the results, they didn't mention something that somebody else might have missed, or in the appendix, or something like that. You want to make sure that everybody agrees, and if there are any disagreements or things that are missed, that you all can come back together and reread the article together and make sure that you're getting the data that you need. And again, this abstraction form is also something that can be iteratively updated. This is just one example of again, from that same kind of study that we talk about. So some common things that you're always going to kind of want is author year, probably country, and then kind of what the study design is. And then for this one, we decided these were some of the things that we decided that we wanted to kind of abstract from the individual studies. Your systematic review will be different depending on kind of what your topic is. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Harrison.
All right, we're already over time. I don't see anyone coming in. So I will talk, and I'll talk quickly until or through you guys walk out and go to your flight, or someone comes in and kicks out. All right, data analysis. So this is actually somewhat gets into the point that James brought up earlier. What's the difference between a meta-analysis and a systematic review? That's the first point. I actually kind of like the peanut butter and jelly analogy, because in this, systematic review is the peanut butter, in that you always have peanut butter on it, and you might have jelly. But you're a sociopath if you just eat a jelly sandwich. I'm sorry. If that's a thing you want, like, whatever. So a meta-analysis implies that as a systematic review that you then take the data you've extracted, and you are now combining results from multiple studies on a single PICO question to get a summative effect estimate, whether that's a relative risk, an odds ratio, what have you. So if you're just doing a systematic review without meta-analysis, you're mostly doing a write-up of what went into each study, what the outcomes of each study were, and this is much more structured than what a normal narrative review are. There are actually specific categories. It's more than what I can go into, with the time, but it's something that the Cochrane collaboration and the Cochrane handbook has a great primer, and frankly, like 20 chapters on. You can also just look at a few other systematic reviews, because they really are standard. And just like every other study type, we have guidelines for reporting and systematic reviews, which also tell you these are the things that you need to have section-wise. For meta-analysis, before you meta-analyze your data, you really need to think about what the criteria are that are going to say whether you actually can pool this data or not. The biggest challenge that comes into play is when you have heterogeneity between studies, when you have 2 or 3 studies that are ostensibly studying the same thing or asking the same question, but because they had really different inclusion criteria, or they were done in very different places, or the intervention was applied in a very different way, they actually shouldn't be combined. There's some statistical tests for assessing this post hoc, but generally it's recommended that you don't rely on those as your criteria. Some of you may have heard of like the I-squared is probably the most common. It's strongly recommended that you don't just say, well, we're going to put everything in a meta-analysis, and then we're going to say that we should go ahead with the meta-analysis if the I-squared is greater than 50. You're not really supposed to do that anymore. That used to be an old practice in older days, but nowadays we don't do that. Assuming that you can pool all of your data together, you also need to have an understanding of what you're going to do as far as subgroup analysis, and if you have enough studies, things like meta-regression, if you want to get down to that level. What is enough studies? From a pure stat standpoint, it depends. From what the Cochrane collaboration would say, it's at least 10. And it doesn't mean that if you have 10 studies, you absolutely, you're fine to do meta-regression. But less than 10, you definitely shouldn't, is kind of the Cochrane guideline these days. And then you also want to assess for, of the studies that you pulled in your search, are there studies that are missing? Do you have a lot of small studies that are overly influencing the result? Again, if you have a lot of studies, same arbitrary cutoff, more than 10, you can do quantitative ways of assessing this with things like funnel plots. If you have less, it's more of a qualitative assessment. And that's like writing limitations to any other paper, and being critical of yourself and saying, listen, we know this is what we got. That's how it is. And then finally, but actually probably equally important, something we didn't touch on, but critical to every systematic review is not just, well, what was the odds ratio for giving TPA to hemodynamically stable PE patients who had RV strain. It's also looking and in a systematic way grading the quality of each article. There are lots of different ways to do this. The methods are different for interventional studies compared to diagnostic studies, compared to prognostic studies. And they're different in ways that, like, ask a biostatistician, especially for diagnostic studies and prognostic studies. It is much more complicated than I think most of the systematic reviews that people are familiar with, which tend to be intervention reviews. But either way, you're not just assessing things, summative odds ratios and stuff like that when you do a meta-analysis. You're also doing a formal risk of bias assessment, whether that's the capital R risk of bias assessment from Cochrane, or it's something else. It's something to talk over with your statistician, your librarian, and you have to decide your protocol time, but it is, a critical part to this. All right, and then you're done. Update your CV. You're all good. Questions? I know this is a lot and we went over time, but